The war had ended, and Paris lay half awake beneath a haze of dust and silence. The city, once intoxicated with laughter and perfume, now smelled faintly of iron and fatigue. The cafes were open again, the women wore brighter dresses, and yet the gaiety had a hollow echo, like a song sung by those who have forgotten the words. Chéri returned from the front, thin, elegant still, but with something hollow behind his blue eyes. He had left as a man of beauty and idleness, the adored darling of women, the spoilt son of a world devoted to pleasure. He came back as if the world itself had aged without him. The mirror no longer offered comfort. The face it reflected, pale, taut, prematurely marked by disillusion, was that of someone who had glimpsed the absurdity behind desire. He still moved with the same feline grace, but his laughter was now brittle, forced, like glass under pressure. Leia. She was gone. The woman who had once ruled his youth, his senses, his vanity, gone into the shadows of age and retreat. He had not seen her since before the war, when her hands were still smooth, her voice still honeyed. He tried not to think of her, but memory, like perfume, lingers even when the bottle is dry. Edme, his wife, moved through their new life with composure. She had taken the war as others take confession, shedding her innocence and finding purpose. She had become one of those serene, capable women who looked at the ruins and began rebuilding without waiting for anyone. Chéri admired her and despised her in the same breath. He spent his days drifting between old acquaintances, their talk filled with numbers, politics, commerce, the vulgarities of reconstruction. At night, he wandered the streets, seeking something that no longer existed, the soft decadence of youth, the quiet intimacy of Leia's laughter, the perfume of her silks. In the fading light of post-war Paris, Chéri stood like a relic, polished, exquisite, and utterly useless. The world had moved on, but he had not. Summer came again to Paris, and with it a feverish attempt at revival. Women painted their mouths redder, men laughed louder, and the dance halls filled with the rhythm of denial. Chéri, immaculate as ever, slipped among them like a ghost. The war had erased his purpose, but not his beauty. He was admired, envied, and, increasingly, pitied. He visited his mother, Charlotte Pelot, who fussed over him with a mixture of affection and irritation. "You've become too serious," she said. "You were so charming when you were vain." He smiled faintly. "I'm still vain, maman. I simply have less to be vain about." But even Charlotte noticed something strange in him, an indifference that bordered on cruelty. He seemed untouched by everything, as though life had turned to glass and he moved carefully through it, afraid to leave fingerprints. One evening, restless, he drove toward the countryside, to the place where Leia had once lived. The house was shuttered, silent, swallowed by ivy. He hesitated at the gate, his heart tightening with something that was not quite love and not quite grief. Inside, the air was heavy with absence. He walked through the rooms, tracing with his fingers the faint outlines of her life, the scent of faded powder, the impression of a hand once resting on a chair. He closed his eyes and could almost hear her voice, laughing, indulgent, the voice that had once commanded him as a mistress commands a beloved pet. He learned from a neighbor that Leia lived nearby, withdrawn from society, aging gracefully, surrounded by flowers and quiet. The thought both comforted and disturbed him. The next day, he saw her. She stood in the garden, her hair silver, her figures softened by time. When she turned, her eyes, still bright, still ironic, met his. They spoke little, Words were inadequate for the distance between who they had been and who they were now. When he left, she called after him, softly, "Take care, Chéri. The past is no place to live." But he knew, even as she spoke, that he was already trapped there. Autumn descended, cold, merciless, luminous. The city glittered again, as if to mock him. Chéri spent his days drifting through it, aimless, beautiful, haunted. The visit to Leah had awakened something unbearable, not love, but the pain of having once been loved. He could not reconcile the woman he had seen, serene, content, at peace, with the goddess of his youth. She had aged, yes, but with dignity. She had accepted what time demanded. He, on the other hand, remained suspended, a man embalmed in his own vanity. At night, he dreamed of her, not as she was, but as she had been. The scent of her skin, the languor of her laughter, the slow cruelty of her tenderness. In his dreams, he was young again, adored again, whole again. But morning always came, cruel and clean, showing him what the mirror could no longer hide. He grew impatient with everything. Edmé's calm, his friends' dull talk of survival, the hollow gaiety of Paris. Nothing touched him, nothing burned. One evening, he went to a party, one of those new post-war gatherings where youth and cynicism danced hand in hand. The air smelled of smoke and violets. The women, with their short hair and bold mouths, were creatures of another age. They looked at him with a curiosity tinged with pity, the beautiful relic of an older sin. A young girl asked his age. He lied. She laughed lightly. "You're too perfect to be real." Her words struck him like a blow. Too perfect, meaning lifeless. That night, in his room, he stared at his reflection for a long time. His beauty, that cruel gift which had once been his power, had become his prison. His youth, that shimmering lie, had abandoned him. Yet he could not forgive the world for surviving his decline. The realization came slowly, like dawn over a ruined garden. Leah had been right. He was the past, and the past, once adored, now disgusted him. He poured himself another glass of brandy, his hands trembling. Outside, the city pulsed with a life that no longer wanted him. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be unnecessary. The days grew shorter. The gray light of winter seeped into everything. Paris, impatient as always, had already forgotten the war, and those who could not forget were left behind. Chéri withdrew further into himself. He wandered through his house like an elegant ghost, touching things as if they might vanish at any moment. The mirrors multiplied his loneliness. He no longer saw his face, only the memory of what it had been. Edmé had found her calling among women of her generation, rebuilding, caring, working. She pitied him, gently but firmly, the way one might pity a wounded bird that refuses to fly. "Come with me," she said once. "There's so much to do. The world is being born again." He looked at her and smiled with that strange, tired charm. "The world may be, my dear, but I'm not." He began spending his nights in silence, surrounded by the relics of a vanished elegance, gloves, perfumes, photographs, letters. Each object seemed to whisper of a time when he was adored, when his beauty had meaning. He wrote a letter to Leah, but tore it up before finishing. What could he say? That he missed her? That he envied her peace? That he, who once ruled through pleasure, now lived like a ghost, haunting his own life? Outside, snow began to fall, soft, merciful. He watched it from the window, feeling oddly calm. For the first time, he did not resist the thought of disappearing. He imagined Leia asleep in her quiet house, the scent of her garden drifting through the shutters. She had survived him, and not by accident, but by will. The realization humbled him. Love, it seemed, had not been his tragedy, but his excuse. The real tragedy was this, that he had loved nothing more than his own reflection. Spring came again, gently, almost mockingly. The city was full of new life, young faces, new fashions, new loves. But Chéri did not belong to this rebirth. He had retreated to Leah's old house in the countryside, now nearly abandoned. The rooms smelled of dust and lilac. Each corner breathed with her ghost, not as a haunting, but as a presence of calm he could never reach. He walked through the garden where they had once laughed together. The grass grew wild, the roses untended. He sat beneath the old arbor, the sound of bees humming faintly in the distance. The air was soft, full of the indifferent beauty of the world continuing without him. He thought of Leah's face, serene and wise, of Edme's strong, quiet strength, of all the women who had lived beyond his love. The thought no longer wounded him. It only confirmed what he had finally understood, that his life had been a long, exquisite pause between the living. In the stillness, he took out his revolver, the same one that had hung uselessly in his room since the war. He turned it in his hand, studying the polished metal, the reflection of his face, pale, fine, unreal. There was no despair in him, only fatigue, the same fatigue that comes after too much pleasure, too much beauty, too much self. Outside, the first swallows cut across the sky. Somewhere a bell rang, the sound of life, indifferent and eternal. He raised the gun, steady, graceful even now. The last of Chéri, the last echo of a world that worshipped youth and forgot to grow old, ended not in passion, but in silence. When they found him, the garden was filled with sunlight, the lilacs trembling in bloom, and Paris, unchanged, went on laughing.